department's involvement in Bush Forever, but I'm going to add a little bit on the end about, or actually probably be a reasonable amount on the end about the strategic assessment of the Perth and Peel, mostly because that's where I am at the moment, the last little bit, but also because Mary asked me to give some input on that so that people know where that might happen, and it's in context of what we might be able to do with Bush Forever with future, or how we might be able to engage with it in future. It's actually quite a useful thing that's happening at the moment. Okay, actually, and I'd like to start off with just really thanking Bronwyn and Greg for their talks, because a very large part of where we are with Bush Forever isn't about Bush Forever. It's about all the things that have gone on before, and you know, it's just one stage along, as several people said, a journey that we've been going in context of conservation management across the greater Perth area. So DEC and its predecessor agencies, CALM, I was possibly one of the first people employed in CALM after Greg was the last person employed in Fishes and Wildlife, perhaps, long time ago. CALM was involved very early on, and I guess its major role, obviously, is that DEC CALM then is a major manager of conservation lands throughout the area. And when Perth Bush Plan and Bush Forever was put together, a very large part of the initial selection, or a large part of the consideration, was the areas that are already under some protection. It was a matter of looking at, okay, what do we already have, how well as our conservation reserve system and our other protected area systems, I guess, sampled the biodiversity. And as Greg pointed out, over a period of time, we've actually been getting better and better and better at that. So we actually were starting off as a quite good basis to start with. So DEC still is a major manager of lands. And I guess I'd add, as Bronwyn mentioned, one of the things we actually changed over that time is that, as she said, I know of a couple of sites I think she was talking about where our advice at the time was, oh, we don't want that little patch of swamp, because it was swamp, because A, it has no trees, not very big, and obviously therefore has got no conservation value. We now know that they're TECs and rare flora, and fortunately we also grow as the whole of community grows, I guess, now understanding. So DEC, the information that, I'll say DEC, and when I say DEC I mean the various iterations of permutations, because there was a Department of Environment in there, and Bronwyn was a member of DEC for a little while and then it's gone off to Office of EPA. So most of you, I think some of you know how those sort of things change. As we were just saying, it's a way of keeping us on our toes. Primary manager of conservation lands, a very large part of the information that went towards making those decisions that Bronwyn was talking about came out of DEC researchers and other researchers. So it's that's a very important part of what Bush Forever is about, is the actual scientific basis of that information. We were involved in the actual preparation of Perth's Bush Plan. One of my first, in fact, it was almost one of my first things when I first arrived in the Swan region, was I was put in as the CALM then's representative on Perth Bush Plan. And of course, we are the intended end manager of very many of the sites that have been selected, the additional new sites. DEC also have a very important role in concept of off-reserve and advisory programs. So a large part of Bush Forever is that not all those lands are going to be conservation areas. There's an expectation through Bush Forever that there's a range of managers and a range of management regimes. And I guess the other thing I also haven't added up there is that we actually have a very important role in context of decision making and providing advice, as Loretta made comment about, statutory planning advice, but also through the native vegetation clearing process. DEC has a role in those decisions. When Bush Forever was released in 2000, there was 51,000 odd hectares, 287 sites. Even at that time, this is the overlay of the Bush Forever sites, Rent Veg and the DEC managed lands. We were involved in managing 102 sites, or parts of sites, of 25,000 hectares. About half the area at that time was already under DEC management. At the moment, we're managing 120 sites, or parts of sites. Again, there's all sorts of strange things happening with a lot of Bush Forever sites, because, as Bronwyn said, there'll be an area, and it's not just tenure based, there'll be different bits added on, because if there's a valuable area adjacent to a reserve, it was included. And so we're managing about 39,000 hectares of that 52,000 hectares originally of Bush Forever sites. And I'll go on a bit more about the management and what that means, but WAPC is the next largest manager of Bush Forever sites, as Loretta said. There's about 16,000 hectares-ish. That includes some of the regional parklands that DEC manages on behalf of WAPC, that are owned by WAPC. As was mentioned earlier on, the Swan region of DEC has been working with WAPC over the last year or so, looking at what areas of those lands would come across, or could come across, to DEC. There's about 8,000, 9,000 hectares of that is an obvious, that would come across because of the values of the land, because of the size of the areas, the sorts of things. It's the sort of land that would normally come to DEC. I'd also point out there's an awful lot of other areas that would go to a local government or something like that. As was mentioned, there's some technical issues to do with that transfer. The technical issues are the technical issues, things to do with funding, but also to do with sequencing of it. If you're looking at transfer of 8,000 hectares of land into a new manager, there's actually, you can dump them all at once, which is going to cause us all sorts of problems, or we can do it in a controlled manner and make sure that there is the funding and there is the resources, there is the process to accommodate that. So that is an intent of both DEC and WPC that happens over the while, and that's one of the things we can look at. The lands that we've taken on, so we already have taken on a fair amount of land already. That's come with a minimal increase in resources. Full stop. And obviously the level of management by DEC varies over the landscape. And you know, one of the things I'd like to say is that DEC is an extremely efficient manager of lands because we do a very large area on a very small budget compared with other places. But that is actually easy for us because we have had this habit, had this philosophy in the past at least, and still do, of getting large areas or having large areas to manage. Managing a large intact area is an awful lot easier, a lot cheaper than managing smaller areas. So you know, the design of the reserves is important. The threats that each of the reserves actually have influences how much management they require and the levels of public use. And the big difference between bush river sites is they are sites in an urban area, in an urban landscape, and so there is an expectation that there will be increased people use. People like to use things, therefore you have to do a whole bunch of other works to make them, to protect the bushland, I guess, from that love. And the not love happens as well, which is a very large part of the management of a lot of bush river sites, is fixing up the damage, replacing the fence that's been stolen and things like that. So our management ranges, you know, a huge different range in per hectareage basis. And in some ways that's not a very efficient way of actually talking about it because there is those differences in what is required in an area. And as a comparison, local governments can manage areas, you know, they're up to $1,000 per hectare, again, because in a lot of cases, the local governments are looking after smaller areas, and those areas often have an even greater expectation than DEC managed lands of visitation and use and that sort of stuff. So the cost of managing small areas and to maintain those values is actually reasonably high. If you're looking at establishing reserves, there's actually an initial startup cost in context of fencing and access control and your initial weed management and that sort of stuff that goes on. And if you actually want to recreate vegetation, I'll put this one in, it actually costs an awful lot more than protecting what you've got. So our philosophy has always been, let's look at what you've got as opposed to trying to make new stuff. So while DEC manages a very large part of the area, Bush River was actually predicated on a whole suite of different management and different protection regimes. It was never intended that all that land would come under DEC management. There's always an expectation that there'd be local government involved and private people involved. And I guess that's, in some ways, that's one of the really nice things in a fuzzy way. You actually got everyone accepting and thinking Bush River and bushland is important, which is actually a really important goal of itself. So there's about 13,000 hectares. The numbers are going to vary. And I wouldn't necessarily want to be quoted on any of these except that I've written them down. But I know that I know that if I'd actually do this again now, I'll get different numbers, but it won't be that much different. So local government manages a very large area of bush river sites, and whereas WPC owns lands that's going to be transferred to DEC or to local governments or others, the local government areas, by and large, will stay within local government. There's a whole suite of areas that are actually managed by state government agencies, and a lot of those are intended for infrastructure, and it's what you can actually get out of the bushland and the conservation values out of those sites at the same time. The Commonwealth Government is responsible for 4,000, nearly 5,000 hectares of land. That includes the Perth and Jandakot airports, but also their other Department of Defence properties is a very large part of that. And there's 2,000 or 2,800 hectares of land that's actually owned by private individuals or companies, and that's a very large ownership as well. And in itself, that's, you know, so there's a very large proportion of the bush river areas that aren't under centralised DEC management. Therefore, there's a need for some interaction with those land managers to assist them and to provide them with advice and assistance to do that work, and also provides, I keep on thinking of future, the options for improving the protection and management of those areas that are under other management regimes. And there's also, in amongst those other agency or local government, there's a whole suite of public participation and community involvement exercises that also applies for the DEC managed land. So it's not just, there's a huge involvement of other people in there as well. So after my talk, Kate Brown will be talking about the Urban Nature Program. So I shall give a very quick, brief introduction to that. But that was one of the programs that was specifically started up to work on bushriver sites. And so it was looking at how do we build the capacity of bushland managers to manage their bushland, how do we give them the information, the technical advice and support to do that. A very large part of what the Urban Nature Program has done, and I'm hoping Kate will go through this, has been looking at what is the best practice, and actually not just saying this is best practice, but actually showing what it looks like when you do it. And that's a really important use that Urban Nature has had. There are also other programs that the department runs, and there's other programs that other agencies run. But we've got the Voluntary Nature Conservation Covenants, a program where people book in and they get some assistance, but they also get a strong recognition. So that value of the recognition and the assistance is actually very important for private landowners who want to look after their bushland. Similarly, the Land for Wildlife is one with a slightly less statutory basis. I just make the note that all those programs are opt-in, they're voluntary programs, whilst sometimes we end up with conservation covenants as a condition of subdivision. By and large, our experience is that they don't work out very well, because in most cases the people who have them don't want them. And the whole concept of the whole way the covenanting program works and the Land for Wildlife program works is that we're actually working with people who actually want to do the work, so we're partners in it. Where a conservation covenant that is imposed as a condition of subdivision gets sold to someone who does want it, that's a good thing. But you can't guarantee that. And I guess, and a context of within the Perth and Peel, or within the Perth area where Bush Forever is, a very large number of those landowners don't necessarily want to manage the bushland. They've got other values that they're thinking about. So that's a very, very quick summary of the Bush Forever program. And what I want to do is have a little talk about what I think maybe are some of the gaps that we can then talk about if we're talking about I guess the next part of Bush Forever, or a report carding on Bush Forever. And then I'll actually go back into the strategic assessment very briefly. But there are gaps in what Bush Forever is, how we've implemented Bush Forever. And there are gaps on behalf of the Department of Environment and Conservation, other agencies as well, and also society, I guess. Some of these are towards some of these can be fixed, and some of these will come out from other speakers. I'm absolutely sure that others will talk about some of the things that can be done better and can be done really well. Before I go there, I'd actually repeat both Greg and Bronwyn's points, is that where we are now is incredibly, is an incredible achievement for us to have got to a situation where we've got the Bush Forever sites that we have, and we're actually protecting the areas we have. Compared to other places, we've done a pretty good job. And I guess it's easy for us to forget that we've done a pretty good job. Still want to do better, but we've done pretty well. But there's some delivery gaps. Not all the sites are in the final management, obviously. Some of them are still with WPC. Some of the negotiated planning solution sites have still got to be finalised. So there's still not an absolute delivery of sites. If you looked at percentage or hectare areas, it's most of the way, it's 90-something %. Pretty high, but there's those last few little niggling ones that are causing all sorts of problems. There's gaps in protection. Because there's a range of protection sites, not all the areas are formal conservation reserves. They're not equally protected. There are threats that can occur. There are managements and actions that can occur on Bush River sites that you wouldn't expect from a nature reserve. Again, that was kind of the idea of Bush River, that would actually happen. So we shouldn't necessarily expect them all to be the same, but it'd be nice if they were. There's expectation gaps. Well, that's straight onto that. There's an expectation perhaps in some people that Bush River sites are absolutely like nature reserves. They have to be protected like that. It was never intended that way. I think it would be fantastic if they were, but that's the program we've got. There's expectations on the other hand as well. There's lots of people who own Bush River sites who think, it's just one of those things you have to go through and we can change it. So we have to know what people are expecting, what the expectations of the community, what managers, what owners have, that we can actually provide that. There's some process gaps. How do we actually implement some of the things we need to get done? How do we fix up the delivery and protection gaps? There's some resource gaps, obviously, there always will be. We've got And I guess, again, we forget that we're in a massively rich and massively important area, and that we need to manage sites, and it costs a lot of money to manage sites, and everywhere is kind of important. There's, you know, we forget how biodiverse our area is, and it was great to have Greg and Bronwyn to remind us at the very beginning, so we remember that it's not just that they're just patches of bush. There's a tendency for people to skip over the Perth and go somewhere else to go and find the biodiversity, but you don't need to go very far at all. And the participation gaps is an important one, and that's very much, I mean, the people in this room are very much ahead of the game society-wise. We actually, we all appreciate the biodiversity that we've got in Perth. We think it's important, we want to work for it. Sometimes you have to remember, and you see that when you go out and you see the rubbish and the fence and everything else, that we're a small part of society, and the rest of society isn't necessarily in the same spot as us. So we're ahead of the game. UBC is ahead of the game, and that's one of the things we also always need to be aware of. How do we encourage other people to actually take up this understanding and this love of what we've got? And I think if you get that, once you get the support, all these other things come. And I think that was one of the points that Bronwyn and Greg made, is that, you know, I've had the same experience. We had a conference the other week where we had a whole bunch of American, actually overseas researchers come over looking at just thrombolites, microbiolites and that sort of stuff. So they were looking at, and then when they realised that we had Lake Richmond and Lake Clifton within a short stone throws distance of Perth, they were gobsmacked. And they thought that was really, really special, because they have to go all the way to the Bahamas to do their work, whereas we can just jump on the freeway. So they were gobsmacked by what we were actually, and they just couldn't. They were sort of having trouble coming to grips with the fact that there's this something that's so amazingly special and so amazingly respected and thought of in overseas. They have manga comics on thrombolites. I didn't know that till the other week, which I thought was amazing. Anyway. That we are so blasé about it, and we don't, it seems like we don't care. And so they were horrified by a few things that we tend to do, or are proposing to do, as in WA. So not everyone appreciates what we're doing. There is mistreatment. We need to actually change that and get people to encourage to actually work with it, because we can get very complacent, and we can get complacent because we say this is special. We don't, sometimes even I forget how really, really special we've got. And that's something we need to keep on remembering, keep on reminding ourselves about. Anyway, I said I'd talk about the strategic assessment. I'll give a very brief summary of it, just so most of you, I expect an awful lot of you already know about it and know what it's about. Very brief summary, and then at the very end I'm going to go back and actually say what does it mean for the Bush Forever and Bush Forever implementation as well, what we really want to talk about. But the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, the Commonwealth Act, deals with nationally and internationally important threatened species, heritage places, and it calls them matters of national environmental significance. So you'll hear the word MNES, or matters of national environmental significance, a bit. And they are the things that are listed under the Commonwealth legislation, like listed threatened species and ecological communities, migratory species under international agreements, so that the Jamba, Kamba, etc. Wetlands of international importance, heritage places, and there are other matters that are protected under the Commonwealth, under the EPBC Act, most notably in the Perth and Peel area, Commonwealth land, and actions by Commonwealth agencies. Historically, we're all experienced with the EPBC Act on a project-by-project basis, an individual development, and what happens with that. The EPBC Act also allows for a strategic assessment, which can consider a large number of actions or a large number of areas, and so it enables you to look at a much larger time scale and a much larger area. And it does that by the proponent, in this case it's the WA government, prepares a plan for detailing what matters of NES we're going to have, or how they're going to be minimised. The benefits of a strategic assessment obviously is you avoid the case-by-case assessments, which can be very, very time consuming and don't necessarily always come up with the best outcome for anyone. But you end up with a coordinated and a landscape approach to biodiversity. So instead of having to look at a single site, we can look at the whole landscape, look at the cumulative impacts. I would hope that it enables us to look at the environmental impacts or environmental matters very early in the statutory planning process. So a very large thing we come across is that things get delayed in decision-making processes until it's almost too late to do anything about it. If we can bring those decisions and that consideration earlier, that's a good thing. It sets clear goalposts on what can be achieved and what can't be achieved, what what expectations that a developer or a community should have about what we're going to do in the area, and it reduces administrative burden. And depending on who you are in government or other government or communities, some of those things are more important than others. So in 2011, the state and the Commonwealth actually signed an agreement to carry out a strategic assessment. There's a formal process going on. This is the boundary we're looking at, so it includes the Perth Metropolitan Region, the MRS as we know about, the Peel Region Scheme Area, which is the Peel, and a little bit to the north that talks about the DEC managed lands to the north there, so it's the national parks, the state forests, which have got pine plantations in, which is the reason why that's in. The strategic assessment is being coordinated by the Department of the Premier and Cabinet, and ourselves and Planning and Office of EPA, Department of Mines and Petroleum, Department of Water and SOPAC are involved in preparing that. Even that looks like it's getting bigger than Ben-Hur. The intent is it's going to be released, all the documentation, the draft documentation for public comment will be released in 2013. The process, it's kind of like an impact assessment on small scale but writ large. So the proponent just prepares a program of what they're going to do, which looks at what are the actions. So the actions are things like what development, where that's going to be happen, and what are the measures that will be implemented to prevent those from having an impact on matters of NES. So what are we going to do, and how are we going to stop that from doing damage? And that involves how we're going to stop the damage, how we're going to avoid the damage, but also what conservation programs we can put in place that actually help the matters of NES to persist. In doing that, we also then produce an impact assessment report, which is just almost like a standard impact assessment report, but quite a lot bigger. That looks at what, if you implement that matter of NES plan, what will be the impact on matters of NES. That then gets, it's a public release, public comment period, but ultimately the Commonwealth Minister for Environment assesses the Menez plan based on the assessment report. If it meets the requirements, then the Minister can then approve the Menez plan. And then after that, there's one more step, that the Minister can then, as a separate step, approve the taking of an action or a class of actions in accordance with that plan. So instead of saying having a Menez plan, everything's okay, there's one more step that goes in and says, okay, urban development, for example, urban development here, here and here, or urban development of this style, or this road system or whatever, can go ahead without having to go back to the Commonwealth. And what that allows is that the individual, after that point, the individual site assessment isn't required. If anyone wants to do anything outside of the Menez plan, so someone comes along with something that's not in there or wants to do something differently, it's all off. They have to go back to individual step by project assessment, knowing full well the Commonwealth's got a plan what's supposed to happen. So there's a good reason for people to actually come on board and actually do their proposals through the Menez plan process. The difference between what the state of WA is doing and what a pure EPB Act strategic assessment is that the state government wants to include all the state environmental values and all the other processes that we would normally go through again. So I guess we wanted to avoid the concept we've dealt with all the Commonwealth EPBC Act issues, and then someone has to go back and actually do another environmental assessment through the EP process. So that's why we've got the Office of EPA and others involved. So we're trying to include all sorts of things. As Loretta said, the framework that we're looking into the strategic assessment is looking at the Direction 2031 and beyond, which is a large-scale RIT framework, and the sub-regional structure plans that are being prepared. And that'll be sort of, I guess, the on-ground basis of what's happening where. They look at what existing approvals, what growth areas there are. But we're also looking at things like the basic raw materials, where the infrastructure goes, and everything else. Try and skim through now. As I said, it's normally only looking at matters of NES, but even under the EPBC Act, there's a requirement to actually have a look in the broader sense of the environment, so looking at ecological sustainable development. We also need to look at uncertainty and risks and adaptive management, keeping some idea on the future. The WA government wants to include other values, so we've got the state listed threatened and priority species and communities, the wetlands. I mean, there's only, beyond just Ramsar, things like vegetation and habitat. And I guess a really useful, important part of where this thing's actually evolved into is just overall sustainability issues. So a very large part of what Department of Planning is involved with in this space is actually looking at the overall structure of the city. How do we actually make it more sustainable? Issues like, how far can we cart water or infrastructure out to the remote throngs of of the suburbs and still be sustainable. The EPA will be doing an assessment through Section 16. They can't do a strategic assessment in this context under the EP Act, but they can provide the EPA advice, and that will look at that broad range of factors that the EPA would normally look at in this space. So the implications for Bush River. So we're still early in the process of developing the strategic assessment, so there's nothing finalised in about what I'm about to say, but it's the sort of the ideas that I have. But just to note that, and again, the state, well, WA over a large period of time has actually put a large effort into identifying conservation areas and identifying the conservation values of the place, and we actually know more now than we did before. And so a large part of what the state government's response in the strategic assessment is actually based on the benefits that we've actually already achieved through programs like Bush River and all the preceding programs that Greg and Bronwyn talked about earlier on. So it's a large part of what our response is, which then means where we say, okay, maybe we're not paying as much, society, government, whoever isn't paying as much attention to Bush River as it was. The strategic assessment gives us another mechanism, I guess, or a vehicle to actually reinvigorate that appreciation, that understanding and the desire to actually do something about Bush River. So, you know, I guess it's an opportunity now, and it sort of coincides with this workshop and the work that UBC is doing, and next year's review through Department of Planning of the Bush River program. We can look at what's going on and actually have, I guess, a tool that, or some reason why we should do much better, apart from the fact it's the right thing to do. So there's stuff we can do. We can fill the gaps. We can the gaps that I talked about before about performance and about involvement and about resourcing. It confirms the importance and I guess gets, again, I would like to say that we'd like to get people realise that that is an important thing that we have done. We've got a very important environment and we need to protect it. We can improve the protection and management. So there's additional acquisition. We talked about, the Honourable John Day talked about, confirming the Bush River sites and the potential to actually get new sites or new areas protected. So either through acquisition or through changes to purpose of vesting. So, for example, a lot of the Bush River sites that are with local governments have got Crown reserves, but they've got a purpose of recreation, which still means that they can be sports fields and anything else. Well, I was about to say it wouldn't be a big change, but it would be a significant change in context of what those lands are for if they have a conservation purpose added to as a purpose. So there's some things like that can actually increase the management, increase the protection of those areas. A large part of what the strategic assessment will be doing is we'll be providing guidance and rules about how you go about avoiding and mitigating impacts on the environment on matters of NES. And yeah, we will be possible to be able to protect additional areas and values. I guess one thing to remember in context of what Bush River was about, and it was the point that Bronwyn and probably both Greg made, is that Bush River was very much looking at the larger scale vegetation areas, and rarity was something that's brought in as an important value, but not the driving value, whereas this is a little bit around the other way. So we've actually got, and so by having done that, Bush River didn't necessarily pick up every single population of rare flora, every single TEC. It did as well as it possibly could in the circumstances. But I guess, we still need to protect the populations of rare flora and TECs that aren't necessarily well protected or aren't well managed. And there may be some possibility for provision of new resources and new information. We are always learning things about areas. So, even that's the surveys, but also how things work and how we work out what our important areas are. And I think that's me. Thank you.
Any questions?
Chris Rand, City Wanneroo. Just a clarification, guys. I know it's got $1,000 a hectare, like the government level. I can assure you it's somewhere around between the $20 and $50 a hectare range. So I'm not too sure where that number was pulled from. But it's about $1,500 a hectare for an irrigated park. So it's running between 20 and 50 for conservation.
Yep. And I guess, I did caveat that comment, and there's some other numbers I have with the amount of money spent by other agencies who look after bushland as well, which I didn't mention because they're just too scary. But I guess the thing is, this point still is, that, and the same rules apply to local governments as to DEC. If you're looking after a small area that's got a limestone pole, whatever fence around it that people visit, it is going to cost you a lot more money to look after it than it is when you're looking after a large area. And I guess I mean, in the scheme of things, I think City of Wanneroo is kind of lucky because you actually do have a reasonable number of largest reserves you can look after.
Yeah, we are reasonable resources as well. The city's been really supportive for the last 5 years. But I suppose that takes me on to another thing, and it's ongoing discussions that we've had with DEC and also West Australian Planning Commissioners. And I keep on hearing this mentioned today about, you know, the acquisition of land, the handing over land for management. And I know as well as anybody else does that works in this room professionally in the area that you guys just aren't that well resourced on the ground to manage these reserves. And, you know, we're your adjoining neighbour and we're doing our veldt control on our side of the fence, but the capacity, especially the WAPC, to carry out any form of weed control around their boundaries, in terms, one, to mitigate the weed risk and also, just as importantly, to mitigate the fire risk, just doesn't actually occur. Now, and that's been an ongoing issue for years and years and years, and I haven't heard anything change. I mean, what do you guys see as the future in terms of being able to be adequately resourced, both from DEC and WAPC perspective? Do you think it will actually change, that we'll actually get decently resourced to be able to do this? Because it's an issue for your adjoining land managers, and we do our best on our side of the fence, and not much actually happens on the other side because of the sheer volume of land that you actually have to manage.
Yep. Technical issues. No, I mean, I always live in hope that things will get better, and we have. I mean, you know, the governments, it's not this government, it's governments have got priorities, and and society has other priorities as well. And that's why, you know, until such time as everyone or majority of people think that it's important to do, you're not going to get, the government's not going to get the push or the support to actually make changes. So that's a very large part, and I know that's a strong part of what UBC and what Mary's been pushing is the fact that people need to appreciate what we've got. And, you know, I keep on forgetting the values myself, but I also keep on getting shocked by the lack of understanding that most people have about what we have. And that's a very important, that's an important mechanism to get there, I guess. We will always be seeking new resources. We're always seeking new ways of going about it that make that easier. We will always struggle, just as any land manager or local government will struggle managing their lands. I mean, one of the values, or one of the things we're actually going through with WPC in that selection of sites is that, as I said, like Bronwyn said, some of these bush forever sites are based on an existing reserve, be it local government or DEC, and additional areas have been added into it. So the logical thing when you actually finally come to allocating final managers is that not all land is going to come to us. Some land will go to local governments because it makes sense to increase the size of reserves. Local governments, I think what you were saying was local governments tend to be better resourced than we are anyway, and they're also better placed because local governments are closer. I mean, not all. No, it varies, and that's the problem with all these things. It changes quite a lot. But the other thing also is local governments are actually closer in most cases to the areas than we are. If you've got something down in Gosnells, we have to drive down from Wanneroo to get there. So that, you know, it's you know, horses for courses. We will always try and improve. We are always subject to government priorities.
I've got a past insiders question.
I don't know what that means actually. Yeah, go on.
One's to do with Bush Forever and one's to do with work on Swan Bioplan. The first one is in relation to those unmapped Bush Forever sites, the ones of less than 10% remaining or threatened ecological communities. We did try to get them mapped because they are Bush Forever sites even though they don't have a name. So virtually all the stuff on the eastern side of the plain, is that going into the Peel? Has that automatically gone into this strategic assessment?
There remains. There should. I mean, as I said, I don't know what the final decisions are. There remains a presumption against clearing, and one of the things is things like the poorly reserve vegetation types, the threatened ecological communities that aren't otherwise protected, are a very important part of what we're looking at. And I guess, and one of the things I keep on pointing out is that on the east side of the coastal plain where they've got these massively cleared landscapes and it applies down a large part of the Peel, if you protected all those areas of vegetation, you're not actually protecting a massively large area. So in context of, you know, a very gross take of areas that might otherwise be used for other purposes, you're not actually damaging, you're not actually in a large strategic sense, is what we're looking at, damaging the amount of urban space. So yes, our intent is to, as far as practicable, have a presumption against.
But are they mapped? That's as bush forever sites. That's the question.
Well, they're not mapped as bush forever sites, so they're not called bush forever sites. They are just mapped as...
No, they are. Sorry, the document says they're bush forever sites. But they're not named because there are so many small ones that they should... And it was one of the things that should be mapped when you're going on to another stage. The other one is the regionally significant natural areas identified by the EPA in the Peel region. Have they all, is that map gone automatically in as well?
Yes, that's gone in as one of our base layers of things we need to look at. One of the things actually have a talk to, because the EPA report that went along that just said that those areas need to be looked at before decisions are made.
But you can read between the lines. I mean,
what we'd like to do is actually have that, you know, that'll probably come out a lot more stronger saying these are the areas that need to be protected to protect the values. So yes. In short, yes. In current government agency speak, presumption against, as far as practicable.
David, Jean-Paul from the Swanbourne Coastal Alliance. Is DEC been considering to establish partnerships, with the committee and try to leverage funding from Coastway or whatever? Sometimes you can get really good management outcomes without actually doing the work yourself, but helping the community. Plus, you've got all those education and awareness outcomes as well.
Yeah, I mean, and again, that's we try wherever possible to use the other mechanisms around to do that, and partnerships either through that are aimed at getting external grant funding is something we also do, but also just getting other people involved. So, and Kate will talk a bit about the involvement with other groups, but our involvement with friends groups and with other people on our land is a very important part of what we do, and it is in the long term how we're going to get things done. We will never have the resources to do the whole work. As most of you probably know, we're involved in actually doing it. The process of actually chasing the grant funding and what is this year's priority theme can be a bit tiring after a while, but it'll always be there, and we'll always be doing that along with everyone else.
One last question, Jenny.
Jo Taylor, City of Stirling. Is there any plans for DEC to recommend to Department of Planning a mandatory minimum land or parks reserve area to be turned over to council when a developer develops land? Because right now it's 10%. It's not enough, and I went to a conference just 2 weeks ago where DEC scientists were saying these tiny reserves, half an acre, even an acre, they're too small, they're not surviving, which we all know as land managers. So they have to be increased, or what's the point?
Yeah. I mean, that'll be something that's dealt with. It's a planning regime sort of thing, and where that can be increased, that would be good, because there is issues that say, I mean, yes, it's 10% of the area, but that includes all your open space, as in your active open space, as well as any of your bushland. So by the time you get your bushland bits of that is actually quite small, and they're actually quite small and quite hard to manage. But then you've got a planning exercise. Okay, in an urban situation, you're balancing an urban landscape, what people like to walk through, see, do, as opposed to a pure biodiversity conservation planning, in which case you'd actually get your areas into one little clump.
Is it possible for a government, state government, to increase that and say rather than 10%, make it law, you have to hand over 20%?
I have my personal opinion, and I think that would be great. I think it would be good to do that sort of stuff, because if we're looking at seriously managing the biodiversity, little slivers of bushland on the edge of a football field and that sort of stuff aren't the way to go about it. We need to actually have well-managed, consolidated, well-shaped, well-designed bushland areas, and that would be the aim. We would always suggest that's the best way to go about it. But yes, we are in an urban situation. I guess the caution is we're in an urban situation. It's very hard to push that, but it would be nice to push that. And if we had the support of the planning in doing that, that'd be great. And as long as they can, they would say they need to have their urban outcomes in context of densities and everything else. But it is possible to have all sorts of urban forms that would even accommodate that.
Okay.